She was 22 years old, fresh-faced, electric with talent, and standing in a makeup room on a Hollywood film set when she felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Across the room stood Marlon Brando, older, magnetic, already a legend, and the moment their eyes met, Rita Moreno later said it felt like being dropped into a scalding bath. Every nerve in her body fired at once. She went into what she could only describe as a full-body blush. She had no way of knowing, in that charged and innocent moment, that the man she had just fallen for would spend the next 8 years dismantling her from the inside out. Rita Moreno is 93 years old now. She is one of the last surviving stars of Hollywood's golden age, and she carries that distinction with a kind of sharp, unapologetic wit that makes you understand immediately why she is still here and still talking. She is the only Hispanic artist to have ever achieved the EGOT, an Emmy, a Grammy, an Oscar, and a Tony, a list of accomplishments so staggering that most people don't even know how to react when they hear it. And yet, when people ask her what shaped her life more than anything else, she does not point to the awards. She does not point to West Side Story, or to the night Rock Hudson opened that envelope at the 34th Academy Awards and changed history. She keeps coming back to 8 years she spent loving a man who, by her own account, was extraordinary in almost every way, except one. When it came to women, she says plainly, he was a bad guy. That man was Marlon Brando. And at this point in her life, Rita Moreno has decided she is done protecting his legacy at the expense of her own truth. To understand why this relationship hit her the way it did, you have to go back to the beginning, not 1954 when they met, but 1931, when a little girl named Rosa Dolores Alverio was born in Humacao, Puerto Rico, the daughter of a farmer and a seamstress whose marriage was already cracking under the weight of abuse and betrayal. By the time she was 1 year old, her parents were divorced. By the time she was 5, her mother had made a desperate and painful decision: pack up what little they had, leave the island, and sail north toward New York and whatever future might be waiting there. The ship ride took 5 days. A storm turned the sea violent. And little Rosa, who had never known anything but warm air and the smell of tropical earth, arrived in February to find bare trees standing like skeletons against a grey sky, and asked her mother if everything had died. Nothing had died. But something had been left behind. Her baby brother Francisco stayed in Puerto Rico with relatives, and that separation grew into a wound that never fully healed. Years later, when she finally tried to find him again, she learned he was already gone. In Spanish Harlem, she and her mother squeezed into a tenement apartment, shared space with other families, and learned early that survival was not a dramatic act, it was a daily one, quiet and relentless. Her mother took whatever work she could find, and when a neighbor noticed that little Rosa had something, rhythm, presence, a spark that rooms seemed to feel, dance lessons entered the picture like a door opening in the dark. She trained in Spanish dance with a teacher who happened to be the uncle of Rita Hayworth, another woman who had changed her name and her identity to fit a world that didn't quite know what to do with her. By 6 she was training. By 9 she was performing in nightclubs in Greenwich Village. By 11 she was earning money doing Spanish-language dubbing for American films, giving voice to child characters for audiences in Latin America. Just before she turned 14, she made her Broadway debut. The show closed almost immediately. But the right people had seen her face. And when Hollywood came calling, she said yes fast, because for her the stage was never just a dream. It was how the rent got paid. She just didn't know yet what Hollywood would cost her. From the moment she arrived, the industry looked at Rita Moreno and saw not a person but a utility. She became what she later called the house ethnic, a catch-all figure they could paint whatever color they needed that week. Polynesian, Egyptian, Gypsy, Siamese, Filipino, Hawaiian, American Indian. She invented what she described as a universal ethnic accent because nobody in any of those casting offices actually cared how those people really sounded. They cared that she looked foreign enough to match whatever costume they had already pulled from the wardrobe department. She had grown up in New York. She spoke perfect, unaccented English. And they kept pushing her away from her own voice as if it didn't belong to her. When Louis B. Mayer of MGM first laid eyes on her, he saw not a talent to develop but a product to package, a Latin Liz Taylor, a Spitfire stereotype they could replicate until it stopped generating profit. She grew to hate that word, Spitfire, the way you hate a label that was never meant to see you clearly. And then there was the other danger, the kind that came with being young and female in a world where powerful men had almost no accountability. Around 1950, a production head at 20th Century Fox began calling her home repeatedly. He tracked her movements on the lot. He tried to corner her in hallways and in the commissary and in small moments that should have felt ordinary. She avoided him everywhere she could for nearly a year until, without any justice, without any consequence, he simply got bored and moved on to someone else. She carried that quietly for decades, the way women of her generation were expected to carry things that weren't supposed to be spoken. Into that landscape, in 1954, came Marlon Brando, and whatever she had survived before felt small by comparison, because this time, she chose it. He was 30. She was 22. He was playing Napoleon in a film called Desiree, and from the first moment she described feeling something almost chemical, something that bypassed logic entirely. She wrote later that every aspect of being with him was thrilling, that he was more engaged in the world than anyone she had ever known. And the tragedy embedded in all of it is that she wasn't wrong. He was remarkable. Brilliant, electric, unlike anyone else in the room. The problem was that being remarkable didn't stop him from being something else entirely when the cameras stopped rolling. Brando's relationship with Fidelity was, to put it gently, non-existent. He pursued other women constantly, and he wasn't even particularly careful about hiding it. Rita would find evidence, women's lingerie tucked in corners of his house, things that weren't hers, discoveries that broke her quietly in ways she couldn't always admit. He would deny, and then the truth would surface, and then he would pull her back in, and the cycle would begin again. She understood, eventually, with the help of a therapist, exactly what was happening. He represented the father figure she had never been able to hold on to, the approval she had been chasing since childhood, the same longing that had been planted in her when her father disappeared and her brother was left across an ocean. She was addicted, as she put it, to the challenge of winning him, over and over and over again. His marriages were their own particular cruelty. He married Anna Kashfi in 1957. He married Movita Castaneda in 1960. He fathered children with both of them. And through all of it, he kept returning to Rita, kept pulling her back in, as though her pain was simply not a variable he needed to account for. Each marriage felt like a public announcement of her private worthlessness. She had given him years, and he had given her heartbreak filed under someone else's name. Then she discovered she was pregnant with his child. She told him. And his response, one she has spoken about plainly and without softening for years now, was to immediately arrange an illegal abortion, handled by someone else, in a time when such things were not just shameful but criminal. She went through the procedure. She went home. And then days passed and she kept bleeding, kept feeling wrong, and eventually learned the terrible truth: the procedure had failed. The fetus had died inside her. She was rushed to the hospital. Doctors intervened. And Brando, upon learning the news, directed his anger not at the trauma she had survived, but at the man he had paid to perform the procedure. He felt cheated. He wanted his money back. The fact that Rita had nearly died was, apparently, a secondary concern. He left shortly after to film Mutiny on the Bounty. On that set, he fell in love with his co-star Tarita Terriipia, who would eventually become his third wife. When he returned, he came back to Rita as though none of it had weight. As though she was simply still there, waiting, which, and this is the part that still hurts to hear, she was. She was still there. Because that is what this kind of damage does to a person. It doesn't announce itself. It just keeps you in place. One morning, alone in his house, having just learned about yet another woman, she went to the medicine cabinet and found his sleeping pills. She swallowed them. She went to bed. She later described it not as a revenge attempt but as an escape, a consolation, she said, an exit from a pain that had simply become too heavy to keep carrying. His assistant found her. She was rushed to a hospital. Her stomach was pumped. She survived, which, as she says now with the particular gravity of someone who has had decades to sit with it, is what matters most. Surviving was where the story turned. Her therapist told them to stop seeing each other. This time, finally, they listened. And whatever door that closed, it closed with a sound she could still hear years later on the set of The Night of the Following Day in 1969, when circumstance put them in front of cameras together again. He tried to reopen things. By then she had married Leonard Gordon, had her daughter Fernanda, and had rebuilt herself into someone who knew her own value in ways the 22-year-old in that makeup room could not have imagined. She turned him down. He lost something in those last years, she has said, the good part of him, the part she had loved. It was all very complicated. It still is. Here is the thing about winning an Oscar. You would think it would change everything. You would think Hollywood, having watched Rita Moreno make history on April 9, 1962, the first Hispanic woman ever to win the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress, dressed in a gown, having practiced the face she would make if she lost because she genuinely believed she would, you would think that after that night, the industry would finally know what to do with her. They did not. The same scripts followed. The same barefoot, broken English characters. The same invitation to shrink herself into a costume. She looked at what was being offered and made the quiet, brave, economically terrifying decision to say no. She stepped back. She turned down the roles that insulted her even when agents couldn't understand why anyone in her position would refuse work. She did stage, she did television, she kept herself alive professionally without compromising the self she had fought so hard to recover. Decades passed. She played Sister Peter Marie on HBO's Ounce in the late 1990s, a serious, layered, authoritative character that had nothing to do with stereotypes and everything to do with what a skilled actress can do when a writer treats her like a full human being. People finally saw what she had always been capable of. In 2021, Steven Spielberg brought her back to West Side Story, the story that had crowned her and wounded her in the same breath, this time as Valentina, a new character created for the film, a hand extended across 60 years. She stood on that set with the weight of everything she had lived and still managed to shine in a way that felt earned rather than granted. At the 2024 Academy Museum Gala, Rita Moreno was honored as one of Hollywood's living legends. She stood in a room full of people celebrating her and responded the way she always responds, with humor and a kind of clear-eyed self-awareness that has become her signature. She told Variety around the same time that she still sometimes catches herself singing along to jazz on her speaker at home and realizes she misses performing. She said there was always a chance she might do it again. Nobody who knows her history doubts it for a second. She has called Marlon Brando the lust of her life. She has called Leonard Gordon, the doctor she married in 1965 and stayed with until his death in 2010, the love of her life. She has described the quiet, unexpected freedom she felt after 45 years of marriage ended, not with relief that he was gone, but with the strange realization that she could choose for herself again in ways she hadn't been able to for decades. She has said she would have left that marriage much earlier if not for Fernanda, her daughter, and the fear of breaking what her child loved. She made choices for duty and she carried them honestly. What makes Rita Moreno remarkable is not simply the EGOT, though the EGOT is extraordinary. It is not the Oscar, though that Oscar was history. It is the fact that she arrived in this country as a 5-year-old girl who thought the trees had died, who grew up in a tenement in Spanish Harlem, who was told in 100 different ways by 100 different people that she was allowed to exist only as a version of herself that made others comfortable, and she refused, eventually, at great personal cost, to accept that deal. She lost nearly a decade to a man who treated her pain as a minor inconvenience. She survived a medical emergency she should not have survived. She survived the industry's indifference after it had given her its highest honor. And she came out the other side still sharp, still funny, still working, still unwilling to soften the truth for anyone's comfort. At 93, she sat down with Variety and said, in her own words, that she doesn't always come up with an answer when she asks herself how she's still here. She usually just says, "You're a lucky bitch." There is a whole life compressed into that sentence. There is the girl on the ship in the storm. There is the woman in the hospital with her stomach being pumped. There is the actress who turned down Hollywood after it handed her the world and still expected her to be grateful for scraps. And there is the woman who walked onto a stage in 2025 at the Billboard Latin Music Awards alongside Bad Bunny and reminded an entire new generation that barriers, as she once put it, were meant to be walked through. She has been walking through them her whole life. She's not done yet.